Okay, this is lesson 2, part 5. This will be the last lesson for this section, or for this lesson, I should say, the last part to this lesson. So we left off here at confounding variables. By now, we've already talked about confounding variables. Like I said, we visit stuff and we revisit stuff. So hopefully you're getting a feel, especially with having read about these in the book, you're getting a feel for, for what these are. These are kind of your enemy. I mean, you do not want confounding variables. You want to be able to control for them. You want to be able to eliminate them. And if you don't, then people will say you have low internal validity. You're not really measuring what you're saying you're measuring. And then your study gets thrown in the garbage, basically. It probably won't get published, right? Confounding variables are also called extraneous variables, as I mentioned, artifacts, third variables, intervening variables, lurking variables. This is just another example. We've already given a bunch of them, but let's say you wanted to study the relationship between hours of television watched, and grade point average. So you might hypothesize what? That the the students that watch the fewest hours of TV have higher GPAs. You might hypothesize that. But let's say you find that. Let's say you look at your data and you find, oh wow, people that don't watch a lot of TV, they have higher GPAs. Now, you would be being overly simplistic and you would be giving people an excuse to beat you over the head, figuratively, of course, if you immediately drew the conclusion that, hey, watching less television means you'll have a higher GPA. That would be too simplistic because you haven't controlled for the possible confounding variables. Maybe television, I'm looking at your data and I see, wow, yeah, the students that have higher GPAs don't watch much TV. And the students that watch a lot of TV have lower GPAs. But I'm still skeptical. I don't think television has anything to do with it. I think that it might be all about parental tutoring or study time. Those are possible confounding variables. Maybe the students that have higher GPAs are getting tutored, and they also happen to be watching less TV, but that's not the cause of the higher GPA. It's because they're getting tutored by their parents, right? And if maybe you look at the data really closely, you'd find some students who watch a lot of TV, but who also get a lot of parental tutoring, and they have high GPAs. So you have to be really careful. You'd have to control for parental tutoring. You'd have to control for time spent studying. Maybe the students who study a lot, but who also watch a lot of TV, get high grades. So maybe it's not about TV watching at all. It's about parental tutoring or studying or something else, right? What are the sources of confounding variables? Well, there are many, and you just kind of have to be aware of these. And I'm just going to go through these really quickly. These are in your book, and I just read through them. You're never gonna. You don't necessarily want to memorize these. It's more about getting a feel for where confounding variables might come from, so that you can be aware of them. So history is one source. Sometimes events during the course of a study, change and they affect the results of a study. That happens sometimes, especially if it's a study that, is done, over time. I remember when I was doing my dissertation, it was in 2008. So the president of Egypt at that time was still Hosni Mubarak before he was ousted in an uprising in 2011. And one of my committee members, the professors that was kind of advising me on my dissertation, said, you have to be careful. What if Hosni Mubarak, who's like really old, he was like 80 at the time, it's like, what if he dies? Then the news coverage could change in the middle and everything, all the results are different. So she's like, you better be careful so that you have kind of like a before and after thing so that you can look at news coverage patterns before and after. She was just like, be paying attention to what's going on. Maturation. During the process of data collection, subjects could grow tired. Subjects are the people that we're studying. Like if we do a survey or an experiment, they're the people that we actually study, that we get information from. They might grow tired or different or disinterested or whatever. That's a possible. Now you're not studying them. Now they're just tired and they're just going through the motions. So that's what you're kind of measuring now. Sometimes testing can sensitize subjects. Like in an experiment, you give people a questionnaire, and then you put them into some condition, and then you give them another questionnaire. And sometimes that initial questionnaire, called the pretest, sensitizes them. They figure out what the research is about. And they're like, oh, I know what this researcher is looking for, so I might try to help the researcher. I'm going to give him or her what they're trying to find. Or the opposite. They're like, I don't like this guy. I'm going to not give him what he's trying to find, right? Instrumentation. Research tools could wear out. That's not really common in our field, more in the hard sciences. Experimental mortality. Subjects could drop out. This is why you always want to have a really large sample if possible, because sometimes people are going to drop out of your study. They're like, I got things to do. I can't continue on. This, again, for studies that go on for a long time. These are more longitudinal, where they take days or weeks or months. In most of the cases, most of the studies that we do on people, they're not going to take that long. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Sample selection. Make sure that your sample groups are the same in an experiment. Homogeneity. I'm going to talk about this more later. But if you're going to do an experiment and you divide people into groups, like let's say you wanted to find out if violent movies affect people's levels of aggression, you're going to divide people up into groups. You're going to have a violent movie condition and a non-violent movie condition, right? You're going to have people watch a violent movie and you're going to measure their levels of aggression. What are you going to compare them to? You're going to compare them to the people in the other group. The non-violent movie condition. Those are the people that are going to watch some non-violent movie. And then you're going to measure their levels of aggression. So you're going to compare the two groups, but you have to make sure that these two sample groups are the same, that they're homogeneous. Otherwise, if they're not the same and you find differences, then somebody might say, well, yeah, you found differences, but that's because the groups are different to begin with. One of them is all men and the other is all women, or one's all old people and the other's all young people, or whatever. So you have to make sure the groups are the same. We'll talk a lot more about that later when we talk about experiments. Demand characteristics. This refers to subjects' reactions to experimental conditions. Their awareness of the experimental purpose may be the sole determinant of how they behave. So sometimes it's appropriate to disguise your study. Don't tell people what you're studying. I did this when I did a study I was looking at the effects of pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian framing in the news. I wanted to find out if we framed articles in a way that was sympathetic to the Israelis and some other articles in ways that are sympathetic to the Palestinians, would people's opinions change about the Israelis and the Palestinians? And I found that they would change. Just subtle differences in framing. But I didn't want to tell people that. I didn't want to come out and tell people, hey, this is what I'm doing a study on. I want to see if you're going to be affected by this framing. That would be pretty dumb, because then people would be sensitized to what I'm studying and they'd probably give me what they wanted, what I want to find. So I told people something totally different. I said, I'm doing a study of newspaper content and professionalism in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I'm comparing different newspapers and blah, blah, blah. And I asked them all kinds of questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also about healthcare and the economy and foreign policy and everything else, so that they had no idea what I was studying. And that helped eliminate the confounding variables associated with demand characteristics. Experimental bias. Sometimes the researcher finds what they want to find, intentionally or unintentionally, so you got to be careful. This is just about, you just be honest. You technically, yeah, the researcher could manipulate the data, and you could do all kinds of dishonest things in research. But that doesn't help anybody, honestly. That would be a betrayal of the scientific process, because you'd be advancing fake knowledge, right? And it's been done. People have published studies, and then people will find you out. People will come back and they'll replicate the study, and they'll be like, you know what? No, that's not what we find at all when we do this study. So it never pays to do that. Sometimes it's unintentional, but you just have to guard against that. Evaluation apprehension. Sometimes subjects are worried about responding. They don't want to be made to look bad. So you need to tell people, when you're doing a survey or an experiment on people, you need to tell people these results are anonymous. I'm not going to share them with anybody. That way that people will relax and they'll give you their honest opinions. Causal time order can be a cause of confounding variables. After starting to answer some questions, respondents' attitudes can change, and that might affect how they answer the rest of the questions, which is why you want to pay attention to how you order questions in a questionnaire. Diffusion or imitation of treatments. Can you hear that? I don't know if you guys can hear that. It's like thundering and lightning outside. So respondents or your subjects, these again are the people that are giving you information in a study. They might discuss the study with others. And that's why you want to make sure that you eliminate those possibilities. Like, if you can study everybody at one time, that'd be great. Put them all in a room and give the questionnaire to everybody at the same time so they don't have the chance to talk to one another. Make sure that you pay people equally. I mean, that money can cause problems sometimes. If you're going to pay people, if you have funding for a project, pay people equally. And then sometimes subjects just lose interest. They get bored, whatever. And then they start putting, you've ever filled out a survey that's like too long? And you start, by the time you're on question 70, you're just like, oh, whatever, A, B, C, whatever. You don't even care anymore. That's demoralization. And now the researcher's not measuring what he thinks he's measuring. And that's a confounding variable. That's a problem. Ways to assess validity. How do we assess validity? Honestly, a lot of the times when we assess validity, we simply do an eyeball test. We look at something and we go, yeah, this measure seems valid. We also call that logical validity, face validity. Sometimes we do content validity, where we just kind of check the operationalization, how we've measured something against the appropriate criteria, right? We lay out all the criteria that would define, say, media bias. Okay, what does media bias really mean? And we would say, okay, well, it means this and this and this. Am I covering that? Yeah, I got that covered, got this covered, got that covered. That's kind of what we do. That's one way to assess validity. This is all covered in your book. You can also visit this website, socialresearchmethods.net, for more information on validity. So there's another way, criterion-related validity, where we would look at either predictive validity or concurrent validity. And predictive validity is where we check a measure against some future outcome. So we would say, okay, this measure, if it's designed correctly, it should predict something in the future. And if it does, then we say it's valid. If it doesn't predict it, then it's not valid. And then concurrent validity is when we measure our measure against a previously validated measure. So, for example, if you're developing a new test at school, you might look at the old test that was already valid and say, okay, well, let's see if the new test compares with the old test. And if it does, then we would say it's valid. That's it for lesson 2. Make sure you read the corresponding, make sure you read chapters 1 and 2. Lessons 1 and 2 correspond roughly with chapters 1 and 2 in your book. Yeah, make sure you're reading all the chapters. Make sure you're reading chapters 1, 2, 3. Read all the chapters. Go through the syllabus. Actually, why don't I do this since this was a short lesson? Why don't we? I'm going to take the syllabus out here. Just make sure that you're on track. It's a summer course. It's online. So you got to be, you have to really be on your P's and Q's. All right, so reading chapters 1 and 2, that's kind of where you should be. The Baxter and Babby also, really by the end of week 2, this is where you want to be in terms of readings. You want to be finished with chapters 1 and 2. So this is by Friday, June 12th. Make sure you're done with chapters 1 and 2, and then you've also read the Baxter and Babby readings that are posted to Canvas. Don't forget, you've got your first assignment, reading reflection number 1, due on Monday, June 8th. Okay, I'm sitting here recording this on Wednesday, June 3rd, but that's due on Monday, June 8th. So make sure you read chapters 1 and 2 of Wimmer and Dominic, and write your little reading reflection. I already explained it once. It's in this, and it's also written about in the syllabus. If you want to ask me questions, please feel free. If you want to come to my virtual office hours, feel free, and I can talk more about that. And then you have reading reflection number 2 due on the Friday, June 8th, and that's going to be on the Baxter and Babby readings, pages 17 to 45 and 106 to 129. Okay. We're going to get into sampling and ethics and content analysis and all that stuff, and we'll just keep we'll just keep going. But the exam is on Monday, June 22nd. You can see that right there. So, for example, let's see. You're going to want to make sure you do all those readings and listen to all the lessons up through content analysis. The content analysis lesson is lesson 5. Is lesson number 5. So you've already listened now to lessons 1 and 2. Then you're going to want to listen to lessons 3, 4, and 5. And then you'll be ready, assuming you've done the readings, you'll be ready to take that exam. Let me know if you have questions, guys.